Today, we're going to be focusing on three main themes. We're going to look at the Edinburgh 1910 Missionary Conference as both the apex of the 19th century missionary movement and the end of an era, as we see in this both the culmination of the various trends of missionary work in the 19th century, and in some ways, the seeds of its downfall in the 20th century. We'll then take a step back and look at those trends in 19th century Protestant missions before looking at the resurrection of global Christianity in the 20th century. So let's begin with discussing Edinburgh 1910 and why Noel calls this a turning point in world Christianity. In some ways, Edinburgh is much more important as what it symbolizes than what it itself accomplishes. This was an event kicked off on June 14th, 1910 that lasted over 14 days, where you had representatives of many mission organizations throughout the North Atlantic world and Europe coming together to engage in discussions about the success and future of international mission endeavors. This was a worldwide and the world leaders took notice of this event. Reports of the council were published in New York and London newspapers, and everyone was listening in. This can demonstrate to us the importance of missions in the kind of broader culture of the 19th century leading up to this event. After an opening prayer and greetings, there were greetings read to the assembled delegates from representatives of the entire German nation, the King of Britain, and the former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, who was initially slated to be a delegate to the convention itself. This whole event was marked with the optimism and the concept of progress that typified the age. Addressing the assembly on the first evening, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest official in the Church of England, expressed this optimistic sentiment, declaring that some assembled might not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come in power. The idea of this conference was to see the full evangelization of the world in the next generation. And therefore, all these people have gathered together to discuss strategies, formulate new agencies, and new ways to perpetuate this. There were 8 areas of concern that were addressed by various subcommittees throughout this event, each of which produced a report. They looked at the transposition of the gospel to the whole non-Christian world. How was the gospel going to go out to all these new places? They talked about the place of the church in the missions field, the struggles and ideas needed to plant churches, the place of education in the national Christian life, so educating people at home to support missionaries, the message of Christian mission in relation to non-Christian faiths, preparation of missionaries, the home base of missions, missions and governments, and promotions of Christian unity. So you can see from just this slate of issues that they covered quite a bit in these 19 days, and much of what would go on here would set the tone for the next generation of missionaries. One of the most important symbolic meanings of Edinburgh 1910 is that it is the apex of the 19th century missionary movement, which would be one of the greatest periods of growth in the church since the 4th century. It's in some ways in the 19th century that Christianity regains its title as a global faith, after a small time from roughly about 12 to 1400 up to about 17 to 1800, in which Christianity is largely confined to the European continent, largely because of the rise of Islam and the destruction and downfall of many non-European Christianities at this time. Just to give you a sense of the scope of growth in Christianity over this period, we can say that in 1800, less than 25% of the world's population professed faith in Christ, while by 1910, the year of the conference, that number had risen to almost 35%. This is a phenomenal growth in Christian numbers over this period. So this whole conference expresses that hope, that success, and that future. But at the same time, the seeds of this being an end of an era are also present. One of the great historians of missions in the last generation, Stephen Neal, has called the 1910 Edinburgh Conference the end of an epoch, in that the perspectives of the assembled delegates failed to mark the diversity of the Christian church that we would see in the coming generations. That this was mostly a European and even more so an Anglo-American conference with representatives of worldwide Christianity still not present. It's only at this time that worldwide Christianity still meant a Christianity reaching out from Europe and its North American extensions to the rest of the globe. This would no longer be the case today as we look at Christian missions as a multilateral element, with missionaries coming from South Korea and Africa and Latin America to the West, and West going out, that has led us into this new global Christian experience, which we'll talk about later. Another end of the era element of 1910 was that it is this meeting that spurs on the growing ecumenical movement in the 20th century. The ecumenical movement is the attempt by most of the mainline churches to come together on points of doctrine and praxis. It is out of the 1910 missionary movement that much of the energy for larger international organizations promoting evangelical unity would be formed, leading ultimately to the WCC, the World Council of Churches, which would be the largest international Christian organization of a mainline bent. For instance, above you can see the flowchart of history from the 1910 missionary movement to the founding of the WCC. Out of this was founded a perpetual missions conference called the World Missions Conference that would bring together representatives of all the main Protestant bodies. You would also see the movement of the World Conference on Life and Work, which sought to overcome doctrinal differences within the church through mutual service. There's also the World Conference of Faith and Order, which sought to at least discuss and find common ground on various doctrinal and ecclesiastical topics. These movements would all come together by the 1960s to form an international discussion group of the needs of church unity. However, over this time, from 1910 to the unity of this movement in the 1960s, we see this drastic change as the liberal theology that had already been coming up in the church becomes the dominant theology in all Protestant mainline denominations. And so, while there is something good about this ecumenical movement throughout the 20th century, trying to bring more unity amongst the churches, in some ways this unity rings hollow as one is being united under less and less specific expressions of Christianity. And much of this ecumenical activity is much larger on paper than it is on the ground. So Edinburgh 1910 represents the end of the era of confessional allegiance amongst most of the mainline, in which many of these churches today, think the United Methodists, the PCUSA, the ELCA, the UCC, and others, tend to look the same and have a similar liberal expression of the Christian faith. Also at 1910, we see these seeds already present. So in germinal form, the seeds of relativism that would flower in the later mainline churches, especially raising questions of whether or not Christianity was, in fact, the final and full revelation of God in Christ, or merely the clearest and best of the many ways to God expressed in the world's faiths. This idea was not prevalent in Edinburgh in 1910, but certain delegates and certain indications of the committee spelled the beginning of this relegation of Christian missions to that of humanitarian aid rather than the perpetuation of the gospel of Christ primarily. And so in this, 1910 gives us both a look back at the successes of the 19th century missionary movement and propels us forward to the shifting dynamics of world Christianity in the 20th century. So we're going to look at both of these in turn, beginning with the 19th century missionary movement. Before the 19th century, 17th and 18th century was not a great time for missions, especially Protestant missions. Much of the turmoil going on in Europe, whether it was the confessional wars or the rise of monarchies, would stifle the missionary endeavor. This can also be tied to the rise of Enlightenment thinking, which tended to hamper the zeal of evangelism. Additionally, many of the Protestant countries lacked behind in naval technology, and so were not able to take the faith beyond the normal bounds. Remember, the faith is more or less contained in Europe in this period and surrounded by Islam to the south and the Eurasian steppe to the east. And there is not much opportunity other than sea routes to spread the gospel abroad. There were exceptions to the missionary endeavor in the 17th and 18th century. We can remember the Catholic Church and the work of the Jesuits, who were coming primarily through the Spanish and Portuguese Empire, both to South America and to various places in the Far East, as well as the Moravians working out of Germany, who are one of the first Protestant missions organizations to move interculturally and internationally. There's also the early work amongst the Native Americans in America that we have discussed before. However, those can be seen as intercultural, but not really international, since they are very much an extension of the local ministry of the church. One of the key factors for the renewed effort in missions was the rise of pietism that we've discussed, and the emphasis on a personal relationship with God and the need to share that faith and bring others to conversion. This would bring a lot of energy to the idea of missions that would kind of bubble over from the revivals that we've already talked about. So in the waning years of the 18th century and throughout the 19th, we saw an increase of missionary activity amongst all branches of Christianity, not just the Protestants. I'm going to briefly mention some of the work of the Catholics and the Orthodox before spending the bulk of our time in the Protestant missions movement. For instance, in addition to the normal orders that we've already seen spreading the gospel amongst the Catholics, such as the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and the Jesuits, many new Catholic orders were founded in the 19th century for the dedication of spreading the Catholic faith. For instance, one of these organizations, known as the Missionaries of Our Lady of Africa, which was founded in 1868 by Charles Laviere, the Archbishop of Algeria. These brothers and then later sisters began their missionary work amongst the Berber tribes of North Africa from their base in Algeria. They would then extend this mission throughout the 19th century into the areas of sub-Saharan Africa, such as Uganda, Zambia, and Tanzania. And as we think about the spreading of the gospel in Africa, we'll note later the great rise of Protestantism and even independent churches in Africa, but we must not forget that many in especially Central Africa have come and embraced the Catholic faith. So in addition to the Catholics, we also see an increased endeavor in Orthodox missions. This is not the norm for the Orthodox Church, with generally throughout its history very little missionary activity. But during this period, the Church conducted extensive missionary work in Siberia, which was largely shamanist at this time, and even further east into Mongolia, parts of northern Japan, and into the New World. Russia, for instance, was the first nation to claim the present-day American state of Alaska and actually had large missionary activity there. One example of this is the Orthodox priest John Veniaminov, also known as Innocent of Alaska, who conducted extensive missionary work in the Aleutian Islands, that chain of islands off of Alaska, and organized missions and personally evangelized other parts of Japan and surrounding islands. The prestige of such a man and his kind of power within the church can be seen by the fact that he was actually elected to be the Patriarch of Moscow after his missionary activity, which is the highest post within the Eastern Orthodox Church. So while the Protestants are also reaching out, we can see missionary zeal occurring in the Catholic and Orthodox faiths as well. And this broader trend might be attributable just to the optimism of the 19th century and the ideas that human progress were available. We could also see the rise in certain technologies, the ease of travel, the increased influence of European nations throughout the world that made it easier for these missionaries to go out. The first Protestant missionaries come from Germany and the Pietist movement, much like the Moravians we discussed. One of the first endeavors of these missions was spearheaded by King Frederick IV of Denmark, who sought missionaries to preach amongst the people of his country's trading post in India, Transquebar. He sought missionaries from the German universities of Halle, which was the hotbed of pietistic scholarship, learning, and missionary training. This is moving out of much of the things we've already discussed of Johann Arndt and other figures. Frederick could not find those willing to do missions in his own country, so he had to reach out to this pietist movement. And once again, see the relation between pietism and missions. If one is concerned with the heart and conversion to Christ as the fundamental mark of Christian experience, these are going to be the people who are willing to go out and found missionary endeavors. So King Frederick IV gets a student from Halle. His name is Bartholomeus Zegenbald, who lived from 1682 to 1719. Yeah, that's right. All right. Zegenbald arrived in India in July of 1692, making him the first Protestant missionary to India. It must have been a rather difficult endeavor. I hope he did not bring his wig with him, but I'm sure he did. However, despite his anachronistic and probably climatologically inappropriate clothing, Ziegenblag attempted to enculturate the gospel by learning the local language, that was Tamil, in which he translated the New Testament by 1711. This would be the first New Testament translated into any of the Indian languages. In addition to his preaching, he also created schools to teach the scriptures to new Christians, commissioned hymns in the local language and in the local music styles, and prepared converts for ordination to rise up and take over these Lutheran churches. So we see at this very beginning a fairly commonsensical action of contextualization, bringing the word to the people in their own language, very much following after the principles of the Reformation and the need to have both worship and the Word of God in the vernacular, and trying to raise up those who understood the culture and could be indigenous clergy for an indigenous church. The first missionary from the English-speaking world of significant note to go into intercultural international missions was the Baptist preacher William Carey, who is often known as the father of modern missions. He likewise would go to India in the East, and Carey's zeal for these missions came out of the English revivals we've already spoken of, specifically the revivals happening around the First Great Awakening. He was very committed to see the Great Commission fulfilled. And as is often the case in discussions of people's involvement and encouragement to missions, he was especially inspired by the missionary work of Paul and his various missionary journeys in the New Testament, but also that of other missionaries, such as David Brainerd, who had been a missionary to the Native Americans, whose journal was edited by Jonathan Edwards. And so we see that many are encouraged into the missionary field by the personal accounts and faith of other missionaries as examples to them. But Carey had a problem. He had to convince the church of his time of the worthwhile nature of the missionary endeavor. Carey was part of a Calvinist Baptist circle known as the Particular Baptists, and some within his tradition argued that one should not seek to preach the gospel to non-Christians because God would save them in his own time, in his own way. This is generally a position known as hyper-Calvinism, such that God's ordaining grace does not need to be actualized by secondary means. This is not a real position, but is a misunderstanding of the fundamental elements of Calvinism. But William Carey himself was Reformed, and part of his emphasis for going out was his knowledge and commitment to the sovereignty of God. To support his endeavor, he wrote a work in 1792 titled An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens. So in this, he's countering those claims that would say Christians do not need to go out in order to spread the gospel, which does seem like a very odd idea. And above me, you see one of his great sayings and his mottos, that you expect great things from God and therefore attempt great things for God. So he saw the power and glory of God empowering us to attempt great things and see God in his work. This 1792 essay was divided up into 3 parts, all of which sought to justify and encourage the missionary endeavor amongst the people. The first part was a theological justification for missionary activity, arguing that the command of Jesus to make disciples of all the world, Matthew 18, the Great Commission, remained binding for Christians. Certain people at the time had argued that the Great Commission had been fulfilled upon the apostolic age, that they had gone out to Samaria, Judea, and to the ends of the world by spreading it throughout Europe. While Carey said, no, this is still the case. Until the Lord comes, we must spread the gospel. We must make disciples. We must baptize and preach the word. After this, he recounts the history of missions activity beginning in the early church and ending with David Brainerd and John Wesley. So we see also here how Carey himself saw the revivals going on in Europe at the time and the spread out to world missions as one in the same endeavor. As we seek to evangelize the non-Christians amongst us and lead them to Christ, so too ought we spread this gospel throughout the world. If we're going to do this, we must know where we're going. So he offers in the third part tables, listings of areas, populations, religious statistics for every country in the world. This brings the practice of knowing the land, having some measure of missiological understanding. And then in the fourth part, he answers objections to sending missionaries, such as the difficulty of learning the languages or the danger of life. This will be a recurrent theme. Missions will take a lot of effort from the church, in money, but also in the time of the missionaries. In order to be a good missionary, one must learn the language very well, and must accept the fact, especially in the 17th and or 18th and 19th centuries, of the prospect of death. Many missionaries, especially to sub-Saharan Africa in this period, would actually go on the ships with their coffins, knowing that many missionaries would die of tropical diseases quite rapidly. In the fifth part, he calls for the formation by the Baptist denomination of a missionary society and describes the practical means by which it could be supported. So Carey actually here very much is the father of global missions in its intellectual endeavor. He justifies it theologically, he offers a history of it, he does statistical work to see where and what sort of engagement one is going to have. He answers objections and gives practical concerns of how this can be done on an individual level for the personal life, and more broadly in a denominational sense to perpetuate the gospel together. Okay, after laying the intellectual and theological framework, Carey himself goes to India to be a missionary. He arrives in Sarampur in 1793, which is in the eastern part of India, and began his work of evangelism. He translated the Bible and Christian works into the local languages. He was a phenomenal linguist and knew many of the local Indian dialects. He studied the culture and produced English translations of Hindu texts in order to equip later missionaries with an understanding of the religious nature of the local culture. He also endeavored in areas of education, founding many colleges along with his fellows and teaching in them to raise up both standard educational practices and to encourage the next generation of clergy. In addition to his work of evangelism and education, he also sought social and agricultural reform in India in order to promote the welfare of the people. What we can see from both Zelenblag and Carey is a holistic ministry even at this early period. The word was brought, education was brought, as well as concerns for the welfare of the people. And although I'm sure neither Carey nor Zegenblag was the best in their enculturational method, they were certainly trying. They engaged well in the local languages and sought to bring the message as well as they can. These early Protestant missions sought to promote self-governing and independent churches. These were not seeking to produce churches that were dependent on the missionaries for their endeavor. In fact, this philosophy was set down quite well by Rufus Anderson, who was one of the presidents of an American missions board. And he describes what these Protestants were attempting to do. What was the purpose of what they called apostolic missions, or missions along the means of the apostles. This is what Anderson says. Apostolic missions means gathering converts into churches at the center of influence and putting them under native pastoral inspection and care. The means employed were spiritual, namely the gospel of Christ. The power relied upon for giving efficacy to these means was divine, namely the promised aid of the Holy Spirit. The main success was among the members of the middle and lower classes of society, and the responsibilities for self-government, self-support, and self-propagation were thrown at once upon the several churches. So in this we see the idea of self-government, self-support, and self-propagation, which is now seen as the gold standard for missionary endeavors. I'm sorry, the date on that should be 1869. And notice that he's not tying this just a method. The power is spiritual. It is the gospel of Christ as the main focus. And the efficacy of this message will be that of the Holy Spirit to raise up not dependent churches, but independent, growing, and prospering churches themselves. One of the great examples of this mode of missions is that of Hudson Taylor, who founded the China Inland Mission in 1865. Taylor was very attuned to enculturation, and he took up native dress, specifically that of a Confucian sage, so that he could be respected amongst the religious sentiments of the people. He trained and sent missionaries into the interior of the country beyond the reach of the Western powers, trying to make sure the church went out into the heart of the country and raised up local ministers and missionaries. So Hudson Taylor and the China Inland Mission is one of the great examples of this. So much of these early missions were done with a sensitivity to enculturation and a desire to create independent, self-perpetuating, and self-governing churches run by local clergy. Some of this would change in the later part of the 19th century, as we'll see, because of its influence with imperialism. So the early missionaries generally began in connection with the expansion of Western economic and political influence throughout the world. So, for instance, we saw that Zegenblag went to the trading post of Denmark in India. Carey would actually go to India under the auspices of the English or East India Company, yes, and others as well. However, they kept a fairly good distance between the nations that sent them and the missionary endeavor. They were not agents of the state in any way, and they often came into conflict with colonial interests. Actually, at times, the British East India Company would refuse to allow missionaries into their areas, fearing unrest with local powers. And so there was often conflict with the imperialism and missions in the early period. This dynamic did change after the ramping up of the imperial endeavor after the 1870s, especially known for the period of the scramble for Africa, as many European powers carved up the continent amongst themselves into different spheres of influence, mostly in order to gain new raw materials to perpetuate the Industrial Revolution. And the question of the missionaries and the imperial powers is a rather tricky one, because they engaged in a rather complex relationship. Sometimes the missionaries were complicit in the subjugation of native peoples and perpetuated the evils of colonialism. At other times, though, they challenged the inhumanity of the colonial officials. No one-size-fits-all picture can be spoken of either the impact of imperialism or the impact of missionaries on any given society. Many different local conditions would change this relationship, whether it be in Southern Africa, India, the Far East, or other regions throughout the world. And each sending nation and each set of missionaries with their concerns would create a complex interaction. So what we can say with missions and imperialism is that it was complexly related, and sometimes the missionaries were complicit in these atrocities, and sometimes they were helping the welfare of the local people, much like many of the imperial officials. It's a very complex set of discussions. One example of when missionaries pushed back against the overreach and atrocities that could be associated with imperialism was the anti-imperial attitude that can be seen in the work of Southern Presbyterian missionary William Shepherd, who was one of the first missionaries, U.S. missionaries into the Congo. Shepherd was a Southern Presbyterian and one of the first wave of African-American missionaries within the Presbyterian Church. Along with his white missionary partner, Samuel Lepsey, this was also one of the first unsegregated missions teams, who worked in the Congo for roughly 20 years. And in this, he saw the abuses of the native people perpetuated especially by the rubber industry, which was owned by King Leopold II of Belgium. So Belgium was very uniquely related to colonialism in Africa, with the large section of Congo, which is roughly 16 times the size of small Belgium, not being a colony of the state of Belgium, but Leopold II himself. So all of the Congo was the personal possession of Leopold II and was run in a rather tyrannical manner. Shepherd and his partner exposed this oppression of the Congolese people by the Belgian authorities, leading to them both being put on trial, in fact, in the Congo for libel. However, by this trial, Shepherd was able to expose the oppression set forth by the Belgian authorities, and it became an international scandal, such that the Belgian people and Belgian parliament removed the authority of King Leopold II from the Congolese area. Shepherd would go on to be a very prominent missionary and supporter of these activities within the Presbyterian Church and beyond. He in fact met with several presidents. He's a very fascinating figure. Moving to another aspect where missions kind of opened up various avenues was the very important role that women played within the missionary movement. And they did this in various ways. By the end of the 19th century, in fact, the majority of missionaries in the field would be women. I'll give a couple examples here. One interesting one are the wives of Adoram Judson, who was himself a missionary to India. He knew William Carey, but he was from America, and then eventually worked largely in Burma. Judson is significant because he's one of the first missionaries from America to go internationally, but his wives are also quite remarkable themselves. His first wife, Anne Hasseltine Judson, was one of the first female missionaries who shipped out to India and then to Burma with her husband only 2 weeks after their wedding in 1812. She was an active participant in this ministry and helped translate the Bible, first a catechism into Burmese, and then translated the books of Daniel and Jonah also into Burmese. She was the first Protestant to translate any of the scriptures into the Thai language when in 1819 she translated the Gospel of Matthew. So she was not just a partner in the endeavor with Adoram, but would take some of the languages, he would take the others to spread the gospel throughout the Burmese people as much as he could. Sadly, she would die of smallpox in 1826. However, Judson's next wife, you can see Judson above, Sarah Hall Boardman, who was the widow of another missionary to Burma, married Judson and was also indispensable for his ministry amongst the Burmese. She oversaw many schools even after the death of her first husband and remained on the field as a single woman, which was rather odd at the time. She said, I wanted to continue my mission despite this. She would help by translating the John Bunyan's classic work, The Pilgrim's Progress, into Burmese, and the New Testament into the language of local non-Burmese speaking tribes. I couldn't actually find an image of Sarah Hall Boardman, but you'll have to settle for Adoram Judson. In addition to the work that many missionary wives did along with their husbands in translation and running schools and various helps, many single women also took up the call to missions and worked across the world. One of the first agencies to encourage this and to support single women on the field was the China Inland Mission, and there are many examples. Amy Simpson being one of the most, Amy Carmichael being one of the most famous in her work in India. But it wasn't just women from the sending countries that were essential to these missions, but also local native women as well, who assisted the missionaries. Many of these, especially in China, were known as Bible women. Their ministry was wide-ranging. Not only would they help and assist the missionaries in translations and in general service to the church, but they openly shared their faith with their fellow women. They read the Bible in communities because they were able to learn to read, and so they could spread the faith to a largely non-literate population. They taught children in village schools, called on the sick or troubled, and worked among the girls and visited women in their homes. So the missionary movement was bringing in both men and women throughout the world, empowering both indigenous people and being supported by the broader church before. All these things developed to one of the largest endeavors in Christian history. It is in the 19th century, with the gospel returning to its place as a global religion. So we said that because of certain elements of history, in much of the 17th century at least, the mass of Christianity was confined to Europe with small communities in the Middle East and India. But with the 19th century and the push of Protestant missions, it truly regained its status as a global religion, which it had had since the beginning. And 1910 in Edinburgh expresses the highest point of this optimism and energy coming out of this movement, as all these missionaries get together in order to move forward in propelling the gospel of Christ. However, the blind spots and seeds of failure are also present in 1910. We've already discussed some of them. One is the failure to incorporate and empower non-Western Christians. We saw that this was the original goal in the early 19th century, but with the rise of imperialism, the upholding and promoting of indigenous clergy became less prevalent. We also see the theological root that will gnaw away at the missionary impulse and its power in the 20th century, that is, the growing relativism. As the 20th century progressed, the mainline Protestant church largely rejected the evangelistic impulse of missions in favor of purely humanitarian work. And we can see this coming out of much of the classical liberalism that we discussed last time. If we abandon the concept of the Trinity and the atonement and the incarnation of Christ and reduce Christianity to nothing more than, as von Harnack says, the universal fatherhood of man, the universal fatherhood of God, the universal brotherhood of man, and the infinite worth of the human soul, and that if religion is merely an internal feeling of dependence, the historical particularity, the message of the Christian scriptures, the uniqueness of Christ are all quickly falling away. Christ just becomes one more example of the highly religious man, and he can be put on the same par as other figures such as the Buddha or Muhammad. So this was motivated by a growing trend in liberal theology that saw Christianity as perhaps the best, but not the only revelation of God. These liberal impulses, perpetuated through the seminaries and many universities, began to erode the central purpose of Christian missions that was even expressed in Edinburgh in 1910. A good example of this was an interdenominational report prepared in 1932 entitled Rethinking Missions. In fact, this report would spark a controversy over missions in the American Presbyterian Church, ultimately leading to J. Gresham Machen founding the Independent Missions Board, which would ultimately lead to him being defrocked. This report, which was in fact financed by John D. Rockefeller Jr., I believe, who was a Presbyterian layman, denied the exclusivity of Christianity for salvation and recommended humanitarian acts rather than evangelism, working along with and alongside non-Christian religions in order to perpetuate the Christian gospel of general human togetherness, not necessarily the gospel of Christ. We see this maybe in some ways as taking the social gospel global. This report was very well received by many active missionaries. One example of this is the reaction by missionary Pearl Buck, who was herself a Presbyterian missionary and quite well known for some novels she had written. She would eventually go on to win both the Pulitzer and the Nobel Prize. This is what she said upon reading this report, Rethinking Christian Missions. She says, "I think this is the only book I have ever read which seems to me literally true." Now, right there, we see what she's doing. She's taking a swipe at the perpetuation of orthodoxy, which claimed the literal truth of the Bible, especially ideas such as the miracles of Jesus, the virgin birth, etc. So she is putting this report, in fact, over the Bible in its truthfulness. Next, she comes to the idea of the nature of Jesus. Although she grants that some on the missions field still hold to the Orthodox doctrine, she says, "Some of us missionaries do not know what Jesus is. Some of us care less. In the world of our life, it does not matter, perhaps, what he is. If we are asked, we shall say, 'I admire him, of course. He was perhaps the best man who ever lived, but that is all he is.'" In this, we see the decline of the central purpose of Christian missions, which is to propel the message and gospel of Jesus, his saving power, his divine sacrifice for us, the pure God-man who's brought us close to God and is our sovereign Lord. For this was supplemented ideas of pure humanitarianism, education, and medical missions. All those things being good, but they have been robbed from their central ecclesiastical focus. Think about comparing this to what Anderson said before. Here, it truly is not a spiritual power to spread the gospel of Christ, nor its efficacy relying on the Holy Spirit, but this is something done for human ends by human means. And this report and the reaction of Pearl Buck, who eventually resigned from her post as a missionary because of the fallout from this, shows the declining theological emphasis in missions that will mark much of the mainline church throughout the 20th century, and will herald much of its decline that we'll talk about in later sections. Other elements of world politics led to a further decline of mainline missions. And this stymied much of the hope expressed in the 1910 period. For instance, the decolonialization of the majority world led to a weakening of the presence of European nations throughout the world. This primarily took place after World War II in a very rapid process. Between 1945 and 1960s, almost 99% of the areas under colonialization before that were given independent status. This led to the increased emphasis on local forms of culture, language, and custom, and in some ways a resurgence of local religious traditions, which challenged much of the foreign missions work in those countries. In addition to decolonialization was the rise of communism, first in Russia in 1918, which dealt a devastating blow to the Orthodox Church and its ability and health throughout much of the century. But communism would also spread beyond into such places as China, one of the major imports here. We'll talk more about communism in a later lecture. But for instance, in 1949, all foreign missionaries were expelled from communist China. So by 1950, the hope of what Edinburgh had given, which was a Christian century with the perpetuation of the gospel throughout the world, with the whole world evangelized in this generation. By 1950, those hopes seemed quite naive, as the Protestant missions that had been so powerful and fruitful in the 19th century seemed to be a mere shadow of their former self. However, just because the missions from the mainline declined in the 20th century certainly does not mean that the gospel was stopped. And in fact, as Sandquist titles his book, the 20th century would be quite unexpected. All of the plans and formulas and strategies set forth at 1910 would bear little fruit. However, coming from within the global church, we would see a powerful movement of the renewal of Christianity throughout the world. And in this next part of this lecture, we're going to see the rise of the global church in the 20th century, something that in 1910 could not have been imagined to the extent that it was, as Christianity grew in every area of the world and that was not Christian primarily in 1910, and shrunk in Europe and North America, the traditional homeland of Christianity, according to the mindset of 1910 Edinburgh. To begin with, let's look at this map. We're going to spend a decent amount of time with stats and charts here because the complex story of the growth of global Christianity across 100 years is a lot of things to tell. And to get the broad scope of it, we're going to look at massive changes within each of these areas. So take a look at this map and the shifts in the dynamics of the Christian population from 1910 to 2010. Looking at the distribution of the world population of Christians in 1910, a couple things should stick out to us. Notice the largest area by proportion, these little squares all represent a certain number of Christians, comes in Europe, with the largest share being honestly in the UK, with very tiny representations in both sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa. Asia as well has a very tiny proportion. Note China with only 2 million. The only one that stands out is the Philippines, which had been Christianized by the Franciscan missions in the centuries before. If we shift to 2010, we see a dramatically different map that seems to reflect much more the actual geographic areas of the world. Still prominent in places like Europe, but we see a large growth in North and South America. But the most significant, clearly, is the movement in Africa, moving from 9 million Christians in 1910 to 516 million by the end of the century. Likewise, in China, we see massive growth from 2 million to 67 million. And through population, the rise of the Philippines as well. This is a dramatic change in the international demographics of Christianity. This can be even more clearly expressed partially by looking at a different sort of chart. For instance, on the left, we see the regional distribution of Christianity in 1910, with 66% of all world Christians being in Europe, with 27% in the Americas, both North and South. Beyond this, there is only roughly 7% of Christians who are living outside of these two areas, which are predominantly populated by those of European stock. By 2010, we see a dramatic reversal. Most clearly, the proportion of Christians in Europe has dropped from 66% to a mere 26%, with America growing to 36.8%. That's largely due to population growth. But most significantly is the rise in sub-Saharan Africa, in which now 23.6% of Christians now reside, and in the Asia-Pacific region with 13%, which is a growth of almost 3 times over 100 years, especially when you account for the decline in Australia, which would be included in this. So from 1910 to 2010, the geographic distribution of Christians throughout the world has dramatically shifted away from Europe and to the global south. And this is also where the kind of new vibrancy and power of Christianity can be found. And this is an epochal shift in the understanding of Christianity. It is in the 20th century that Christianity has declined in Europe and North America, but has gained ground throughout the world and has returned to its position as a truly global church, kind of reflecting the ideal that was set forth in the Middle Ages, where Christianity still was very prominent in Africa and Asia, such that these were 3 lobes of one central body focused on Jerusalem, as the kind of clover map above me shows. Throughout the centuries, Christianity in Africa had withered, except for strongholds in Ethiopia, and much of the Asian church had withered away as well because of the interactions with Islam. But by the 19th and 20th century, the global church and the global nature of Christianity has been regained. Now, there's many stories that could be told about this, with each region and even each country to experience the coming of the gospel has its own dynamics, its own challenges, its own history, and its own list of figures who are significant. We will focus on some of these in broad strokes for the 3 regions of Latin America, Africa, and East Asia, just to give us an impressionistic sense of the spread of Christianity. Our readings will fill some of these stories in for us as we go. One of the most significant movements for this spread of global Christianity is that of the Pentecostal movement. We looked at this movement last time as it spread out of the urban revivals of the American Gilded Age, primarily moving out of the work of William Simpson in the Azusa Street revivals. However, from Azusa Street, the Pentecostal movement would spread throughout the globe and be a very active missionary force, relying on the power of the Spirit and the emphasis on informal worship and activities. We can see from the chart above that while we can guarantee there was almost 0 Pentecostals in 1900, by the time of 2011, Pentecostals and charismatic Christians, who are similar to Pentecostals but not exactly the same, made up roughly 26% of the global Christian population. So much of the shift in global Christianity is due not just to Pentecostal churches, but independently initiated churches in Africa and Asia, as well as Pentecostalism and evangelicalism. And in the global scene, evangelicalism, Pentecostalism, and charismatic Christianities are much closer than they might appear in our American context. So we're going to look at some of these dynamics, starting with Latin America. Pentecostal growth has been most pronounced in Africa, Latin America, and especially Asia. But it's very interesting what is done in Latin America. Recall Latin America came into the Christian world through the missionary endeavors of the Catholic Church through the Spanish and Portuguese empires, and largely followed this branch of Christianity throughout its whole period from the 16th up to the 20th century. However, Pentecostalism has spread rapidly in Latin America, fundamentally changing the religious makeup of the region. The chart to the left tells the story quite well. In the 1950s, Latin America as a whole, which includes everything south of the US-Texas border, was 94% Catholic with only 3% Protestant. By 2014, the Catholic population had declined to 69%, with Protestantism leaping up to 19%. Almost all of that Protestant growth is Pentecostalism and evangelical Christianity, which is functioning as a major player in Latin American Christianity for the first time. And not only has Pentecostalism and evangelicalism changed the shape of Latin American Christianity, but the largest churches in the world are generally Pentecostal. Most of these extremely large churches can be found in South Korea. For example, the Yodo Full Gospel Church in Seoul has reportedly 480,000 members, and a service area that has to run pretty much continually on Sundays to accommodate them all. To give us perspective, that's roughly the same population as the entire PCA contained in a single church. We can see this shift in Latin American identification a little clearer here. Notice this rapid drop in Catholicism over the past 2 generations, the 10% rise in Protestant Christianity, but also the 50%, the doubling of the unaffiliated population as well. We'll look at the dynamics that produce that in later lectures, the growing amount of secularism in Western culture, which has perpetuated this throughout the world. Latin American Christianity is quite varied and is becoming more integrated into the world scene. One of the most significant elements of Latin American Christianity in the 20th century was one of its contributions to theological method, known generally as liberation theology. So, in the 20th century, Latin American Christianity gave birth to a new theological movement inspired by the needs of the poor and the political struggles of Latin America. Latin America was in very difficult times throughout much of the 20th century, with economic decline, the rise of both communist and anti-communist governments with much bloodshed and corruption and crushing poverty. The church responded to this, largely the Catholic Church, by taking inspiration from strands of Marxism to reinvigorate in their understanding the way that the church should relate to the poor. This is known as liberation theology. Very significant in this movement was an initial book by the theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, A Theology of Liberation. This idea of liberation theology mediated through Latin America, in some ways mediating Marx through the Third World experience, would be extremely prominent throughout the world after this. This idea was very much officially adopted by the bishops of Latin America at the Second Conference of Latin American Bishops at Medellin in 1968, and was later more or less endorsed by the structures of the Catholic Church. I'm just going to look at some of the aspects of liberation theology, which indicates the important contribution of Latin America to global Christianity. I should stress that liberation theology comes in various strands, some quite orthodox and trying to bring this in line with Christian action, while others quite radical and departing drastically from Orthodox Christianity. For instance, liberation theology emphasizes orthopraxis, or right action, rather than orthodoxy, right worship, or doctrine, emphasizing that we must first act right before worrying about orthodox questions. And that can be either rejecting overly technical theological discussions, or it can be all the way to rejecting the central claims of Christianity. Liberation is the primary means of salvation in liberation theology, whether this is liberation from political oppression or liberation from the oppression of sin. For the best liberation theologians, it is best. Theology for these figures must begin in praxis, meaning that we need to look first at the needs of the people and from there do our theological thinking. So this is very much a theology from below instead of an academic theological enterprise. And theology must critique not only individual sin, but corporate sin of the oppressed. And this leads to a church for the poor, often known as the preferential option of the poor, that the church should be structured in such a way to welcome in the poor and disenfranchised. This movement had a lot of fruit in revitalizing the Catholic faith in parts of Latin America, especially during the 1970s and 80s. And many of these ideas are being perpetuated and are officially adopted throughout the Catholic Church after the rising of Francis to the position of Pope several years ago. Francis himself was an Argentinian archbishop who was engaged with much of this liberation theology movement. And so this sparked changes throughout the world as other groups in Asia, in America, and in Europe took the methods of liberation theology and used them for their own attempts to express the importance of the Christian faith in their own endeavor. We could talk about this movement more in the online discussion. Moving to Africa, we see just a phenomenal expression of the spread of the gospel in the 20th century. Looking at the map to our left, in 1900 there had been barely any inroads of the gospel into Africa, with some missionary work in the south, in Egypt and Ethiopia, and some work in West Africa. By 2000, this had fundamentally changed, and Africa, sub-Saharan Africa especially, is one of the largest Christian populations in the world, with much of South Africa having populations ranging up to 99% Christian in places such as Zambia and the Congo. Much of the growth of Christianity in this region in the past 100 years has happened after colonialism went away. Almost all of this uptick is after the 1950s, and this includes growth amongst Catholics, amongst Protestants, and includes a large growth in what are known as AICs, or African Independent Churches, those which did not come from the endeavors of foreign missionaries or foreign churches, but were native movements in attempts to bring the gospel to expression in the African context. Some of these movements are very orthodox and clear, moving from the charismatic leadership of individual figures, while others can be more syncretistic in their approaches to the gospel. This is because, in some ways, the heart of African Christianity is found in an attempt to speak about Christ as the one who has been revealed in Scripture and the Christian tradition in ways that deeply resonate with the cultural and historical heritage of the African peoples. This is very much the attempt to fully enculturate Christianity into the African context, not by foreign missionaries, but by native African pastors and preachers themselves. So by enculturation, they're attempting to make the Christian message relevant and accessible to a cultural tradition while remaining faithful to that message. And this has had great effects throughout the continent of Africa, with, as you see, some of the largest populations of Christians in any countries throughout the world. So we can see what the endeavor was by this quote expressed by Bediako, or quoted by Bediako. He says that Christ has been presented as the answer to questions a white man would ask, the solution to needs that Western man would feel, the savior of the world of the European worldview, the object of the adoration and prayers of historic Christendom. But if Christ were to appear as the answer to questions that Africans are asking, what would he look like? This was basically the fundamental question being asked by almost all Christian theologians and pastors in the African context. What does it mean to speak the full truth of Christ within Africa, not allowing necessarily the concerns that have driven European Christianity to determine all of African Christianity? And this is to be done in a very faithful way, and we'll look at a couple means of doing that. And we're going to do that through different images of Christ. There's two main images of Jesus that have great power within the African context. And one is the fact of Jesus as the victor over sin and powers of the world. You've probably heard of the atonement theory known as Christus Victor, which emphasizes that on the cross, Christ defeats sin, but also all demonic and powers of evil in the world. So think Colossians 2, that at his cross he led captivity, that he put the powers and principalities to open shame, triumphing over them by the power of his cross. This theme of Christ as victor and one who has powers deeply resonates with the African worldview, which is a spiritual worldview very much empowered by various spirits, both good and evil, throughout the world. And Christ is seen as the one who triumphs over all evil, both political, personal, and spiritual, and gives new life and freedom. This is how it's been expressed by one of the leading African theologians, John Mettebe, in his work, Some African Concepts of Christology. He says, the greatest need among African peoples is to see, to know, and to experience Jesus Christ as the victor over the powers and forces from which Africa knows no means of deliverance. So in this, there is an emphasis of deliverance from evil spiritual powers. And this is borne out even when one talks and does studies on how African Christians experience Jesus. One study done in the United Kingdom found that 74% of African Christians described Jesus when they were given only, you can pick 3 options out of this whole list. 74% responded that Jesus has power, while only roughly 30% of Europeans responded the same. So the power of Jesus over all spiritual realities, and the one who can protect and save people from those, is a major theme throughout most African Christianities. Another main influence, especially amongst the Pentecostal and AIC churches, is that of Jesus as healer. Jesus is not only the one who has power over the evil forces, but he can use that power to heal from disease and from death. So Christ brings not just salvation of the soul to the African Christians, but also salvation from that which oppresses them spiritually and that which plagues their earthly bodies. Okay, and that's why many of the AIC movements are actually begun by massive experiences of healing of those who will come to preach the gospel. This is how one student of African Christianity has placed it. Especially in the independent churches, faith healing practices play an important role. The most frequent answer given to the question why someone has joined a church is, for a long time I was sick, I tried all sorts of treatments, but without results. I received the advice to go to such and such a prophet. I did that, and now I am better. So in this, we see the confluence of Pentecostal Christianity and global Christianity. Almost all the Christian traditions in Africa have an emphasis on faith healing and the power of Christ over supernatural forces. This is in direct conflict with the liberal Christianity that has been perpetuated in most mainline churches, which is decidedly anti-supernatural and anti-miracles. Miracles are often very much an experiential part of how most Christians in Africa experience and understand the faith. Jesus is the God and King of this world, and he does bring salvation from sin. Don't think that they don't emphasize that. But beyond just the salvation of our souls, there is an emphasis on his removal of spiritual powers and healing of the body. Moving from Africa, we can also look at the rapid spread of Christianity in Asia over the last 100 years. We note here in this map of Asian Christianity in 1910, only real proportions of Christians in the Philippines and other areas of European colonization, such as Vietnam under the French and Burma under the British. And we also see a large proportion of Christians in the Middle East. By 2010, things have changed quite dramatically. One thing is the dispersal of Christians from Turkey in the Middle East, largely caused by policies of the Ottoman Turks, the Armenian genocide, and fallouts from the American invasion of Iraq, in which most of the Iraqi Christians had to flee for their safety. However, we do see a large increase in the populations of Christians in South India and in the eastern part of China, as well as large growth happening in Indonesia. In fact, the largest Reformed university in the world is found in Jakarta, Indonesia. So how did this come about? Well, this largely occurred after missionaries had been removed from the scene and is largely propelled by indigenous leaders and movements. One of the most spectacular of these comes with the growth of Christianity in China. We've already mentioned that after the communist takeover in 1949, Christian missionaries, foreign missionaries were expelled from China. And the communist government, which was officially atheistic, also imprisoned many Christian leaders. Yet, even under the suppression of the communist government, Christianity survived and is thriving in China, largely through the work of underground house church movements. There is an officially recognized element of Christianity in China that is controlled by the government, but most Christians refuse to interact with it because it is controlled by the state. The chart to my left shows the dramatic rise in Christianity, especially into the 1980s and 90s. Some of these stats are a little unreliable, given that the earlier ones were provided only by the communist government, which did not have access to all the underground Christian data. But we see by the current period, there is an estimated 67 million Christians in China. And that estimate might be low. There's debate whether or not that number should be somewhere between 50 or 100 million Christians. Regardless, it makes China one of the largest populations of Christians by sheer numbers in the world. And this growth is projected to grow rapidly into this coming century. The church in China in some ways was overlooked by the West for many years, just not having access to it with the breakdown between US and Chinese relations, well, with the entire Western world. And so this was perpetuated by local preachers, some of whom had been trained in America and then spread the gospel thoroughly throughout. One example of this is a man named John Sun, who was a leading Chinese preacher in the 1920s and 30s, and he laid the foundation for the underground church in China. He was a Chinese national educated originally at Union Theological Seminary, which, if you recall, is one of the largest liberal seminaries in this era. He was converted, though, while he was a student at seminary through the preaching of a 15-year-old female evangelist in Harlem. This seemed to be a rather drastic conversion for John, because his change was so radical that the president of Union Seminary had him committed to an asylum for over 100 days. You can see here that his missionary zeal and his desire to evangelize was seen as so crazy by the leaders of his seminary that he was put in an asylum. However, he made good use of his time while he was there, reading the Bible from cover to cover over 40 times. As one might imagine, he rejected the impulses of liberal theology, seeing them not as faithful to the word, but the product of the American culture. And he rather went back to his home country and preached a very clear message of repentance and faith in Christ. We can see him in some ways as very much in line with the evangelical message. Through roughly 20 years of ministry, it is said that he has converted over 100,000 people. Note, that's not just how many people he preached to, but those who were actually converted by his ministry. A remarkable evidence to the power of God throughout the world. And John Sun is important not just for his missionary work, but in some ways he exemplifies the nature of Chinese Christianity at this time. It is in a new cultural context, and therefore it takes on new cultural clothes. We see this Confucian emphasis on right conduct and propriety mixed with the Chinese influence of independency from the West, as well as an emphasis on the Bible alone as the source of theology. These three marks of right conduct, independence from the West, and the Bible alone kind of mark out most evangelical Christianity throughout China, and indicates how each element of world Christianity will take on its own unique cultural flavor, just as it had in the West before. All right, so we've briefly covered the rise of global Christianity in the 20th century, coming out of the 19th century missionary movement, seeing what happened after the failure of mainline missions in the 20th century. What can we take away from this? Well, first, we must understand that Christianity is a global faith. You might think, well, that's an odd thing to say, but we need to understand deep down that Christianity does not belong to the West, it does not belong to Europe or America, but is the faith of the entire Christian community around the world. We are merely one part of it. That doesn't mean we should despair or think poorly of ourselves because we're not the center of the action all the time, but we are part of a global family of Christians of all source of traditions, and we will have disagreements and we will need to work together. But Christianity needs to be thought of foundationally and fundamentally, not as a Western faith, but as the faith of all Christians throughout the world. Global Christianity also encourages us in our present age to listen to the concern of world Christian leaders so that we can understand what we are not seeing, being able to hear from the outside our own failings and needs. This also offer what we can, hearing how our missionary endeavors should be used in such a way to promote the local churches and to be the most useful throughout the world. For instance, one of these elements might be the supporting of local indigenous missionaries to do the work instead of sending foreign missionaries to that same area. Sometimes multiple 5 or 6 times as many local missionaries can be supported for the same amount that it would take to train and send an American missionary to that endeavor. That doesn't mean that we should not prioritize the sending of American missionaries, but making sure that we're spreading that money out well and wisely and designating that for the right purposes. This rise of global Christianity, likewise, is changing the demographics of the Christian church throughout the world, and not just in these areas, especially through migration. The migration of Christians has led to greater diversity amongst the churches of the older world, with faiths originating or denominations originating in Africa and Latin America, founding congregations in America and Europe. So even the faith here in America is becoming more internationally diverse because of the rise of global Christianity and the return of many of these traditions back to the United States, some of which come to evangelize here. So we should know that, support that, and be on the lookout for what that might do in the future. One final point that I want to stress on this is, as we think back to 1910 and the Edinburgh Missionary Conference, we must realize that no one could have predicted in 1910 what Christianity in 2010 would have looked like. The Edinburgh Missionary Conference was full of hope and was full of a set plan in order to spread the gospel throughout the world. They never would have expected that 100 years later it would be North America and Europe that was devastated and in deep need of the gospel ministry, or that places like Africa and Asia would explode in Christian endeavors not initiated in the West. The fact that Edinburgh was both in some ways a great apex of Christian missions and in some ways a failure to live out its ultimate mission with the decline and rise of Orthodox missions in the 20th century in the mainline churches. The fact that they could never predict that in some ways gives us hope and humility for the future. We do not know what the Lord will be doing with us in 50 or 100 years. Our call is to be faithful, to abide by His word, and to be prayerful in the spreading of His gospel, and have hope that God can do immeasurably more than we can ever expect or imagine. If we need proof of that, we can just think of the massive spread of His word in the 20th century that could never have been predicted beforehand. But it is to His honor and to His glory that we see it. Okay, next time we're going to take our second pass at the 20th century, this time looking at the changes in church history in America over the course of this period. We'll pick up with the fundamentalist modernist controversy where we left off in our previous lecture, and talk about the various dynamics that have shaped the American church into what it is today. I look forward to seeing you then.